Hello, welcome to this video on revising Romeo and Juliet. This little video is going to look at Lady Capulet. Now if we look at the story of Romeo and Juliet and we track Lady Capulet's role in it and her journey, we can see that she isn't in it that much, and you can see that she's completely out of Act 2 and she's out of Act 5, and she tends to appear when we're talking about the marriage to Paris, and that tends to be when she's there. So we see her in Act 1 introducing the idea of marrying Paris, and then we don't see her again till Act 3, when after the fight it becomes a topic of conversation and the parents decide it would be a good thing to cheer everybody up by her marrying Paris. And so we see the mother talking about it with Paris and Lord Capulet, and then we see at the end of Act 3 the informing Juliet of the plans, and obviously Juliet isn't happy with that, so we see Lady Capulet siding with Capulet when Juliet doesn't like the idea. And then we see her in Act 4, and in Act 4 we see Juliet change her mind because of the plan with the friar, and then we see the mother say goodnight to Juliet before she takes the potion, and then we see the sad events where Lady Capulet sees her daughter supposedly dead, and then she disappears completely from the story, which is very much what happens with the nurse. After Act 4, the nurse and Lady Capulet disappear from the whole story itself. Now we're just going to look at a few sections from the text and just kind of go through a few things that's of interest and of note to talk about when you're writing about the character. So if we have a look at the way that she's first introduced to us. So Lady Capulet is introduced to us in this little scene in Act 1, Scene 3 with the nurse. And actually it shows a very, very distant relationship, because actually the way that she talks is that she doesn't seem comfortable. So she says, "Nurse, leave me a bit. I want to talk in secret." But then she says, "Nurse, come back." And there's a sense of kind of almost like she's uncomfortable with the whole thing, and that she's uncertain and lacking confidence. She's not sure what she wants really and how to do things, which echoes maybe the relationship that Lady Capulet doesn't feel comfortable around Juliet, and she lacks confidence. Now we know the nurse will have spent more time with Juliet, but clearly Lady Capulet isn't comfortable, so it suggests that they haven't spent that much time together, so the relationship is quite distant. And that's also reflected in the fact that she's lacking knowledge, because she's not quite sure how old Juliet is, and it takes the nurse to be precise and to be very, very clear. So you can see that straight away Shakespeare's showing us that there's something not quite right in the relationship. This isn't your typical kind of mother that we've got. We've got somebody that's very distant and somebody that's not quite sure of themselves, but also they don't know that much stuff. But also we see with her use of thou that she's quite superior. In Shakespeare's time, to use thou, you tend to use thou if you're in a position of power, talking to somebody inferior. So we can see with that how she views the nurse. It's not on the same equal relationship. She sees her as somebody inferior, which links into the character Lady Capulet. Now taking that further, if we have a look at how she behaves later on in that scene, and she behaves quite interesting. So at that beginning she's quite awkward, not quite clear, a bit formal in the way that she talks, but then when talking about Paris, she has this kind of romantic attitude towards Paris. And when we look at the way that she talks about Paris, she's talking about him in very, very metaphorical sense. Verona's summer has not such a flower. She sees him as kind of beautiful And whereas the nurse kind of implies more of kind of a physical nature, and she's being a bit more suggestive, we can see almost like an innocent aspect to Lady Capulet, in that she's just focusing on the beauty and how beautiful he is. But that also comes later on, when you see this massive big speech from Lady Capulet, showing that maybe she's a bit more confident about talking about these things. And the way that she talks about Paris, she talks about him in kind of almost a romantic idea. So we get this idea of Paris's face being like a book, and how Beauty's pen has written it. And we see about the book of love and his eyes and volume, which is another word for book. And we kind of see that this almost fits into this romantic attitude. So whereas the nurse is very interested in the physical nature of Paris and how attractive he is and how much of a hunk he is, we've got Lady Capulet more about romance and about beauty and about attraction. And so you can see that there's a different type of thing going on here. Is it lust or is it romance? So we can see with the nurse that the nurse is obsessed with lust, and we can see with here Lady Capulet, it's about romance. That's what it is. But also it shows us this idea of the gender stereotypes in Elizabethan times, because if we have a look that yes, the man is supposed to be beautiful and supposed to be fantastic, but also if we have a look at this line here about what he possesses, there's a mercenary element, that the man is there to kind of be the breadwinner, the person to have all the money and have all the stuff, and the woman is just there to look longingly and lovingly at the husband. So we can see some of the gender stereotypes that we would kind of expect of the past and Elizabethan England. Now, when we look at Act 4 and we see the shocking events and quite cruel events of a mother discovering her child has died, it works out quite interesting and quite unusual in the way that she behaves. So previously to before this, she's been very, very emotionless. She's been very, very formal. She's focused on romance, but she hasn't said anything openly loving towards her child. And yet suddenly, when Juliet's supposedly dead, we see this emotional character come out. Oh me, my child, my only life. Revive, look up, or I will die with thee. Help, help, help. We're seeing a completely emotional character. Now, possibly, there are two sides to this character. And Shakespeare does that quite a lot, and any good writer does. You give two sides to a character. So yes, she could be emotionless for most of the time, but actually, under the surface, she is quite emotional. And we can see that, this desperation, my child, my only life. And we see this repeated when she repeats, she's dead, she's dead, she's dead. It's almost as if she cannot cope on with this, which is very much similar to what happens with the nurse. The nurse breaks down. Her language breaks down. She can't talk in the same way that she did before. And this repetition shows that kind of breakdown in the emotional thought pattern that's going on. But then we have an interesting change in that, because she goes from being upset, emotional, to being in the middle there, where she's kind of broken. But then we have something strange right at the end. So we have this accursed, unhappy, wretched, hateful day. So we can see that clearly she's upset. Most miserable hour that ever time saw, in lasting labour of his pilgrimage. But one poor loving child, but one thing to rejoice in solace, and cruel death hath catched it from my sight. Now it's interesting that at this point we can look at it in a number of different ways, but really it's like, why did I only have one child? Why only one? Because it's almost suggesting that she wishes she had another one so she wouldn't have to be so upset about losing this one, which seems a little bit strange to say this at this point. Now clearly they're upset, but at this point you don't think, why would I need another child, because then that would be okay to lose this child. It's kind of an unusual thing to say. So it's almost like there's something else going on here. Is her regret, is she regretting not having more children? Or is it truly about the loss itself? So it's an interesting thing. And this idea also about how she refers to this, in that Juliet has been taken away from her sight, not from her arms, not from her hold, or from her ability to be part of her life, but from her sight, which as a word is quite interesting, because maybe this indicates her relationship with Juliet, something that she can see, something that's there for appearance, but not actually there physically. And so, is Lady Capulet a cruel and quite emotionless character? Or is she somebody that does generally care? This little scene here gives us two ways of looking at it. And it's open up to interpretation, and that depends on you, how you think it. Do you think Lady Capulet is a cruel character? Do you think she's so cold that she doesn't really love Juliet? Or do you think that's a mask and it's hiding the fact that she does love her, but she doesn't know how to love her? So there's an interesting idea there for you. Now, we're going to have a look at some ideas of what we can say. Now, if you get a question on Lady Capulet, we need to think of some good ways of how to talk about the character. So we could see that Lady Capulet is a symbol of the patriarchy's power, of how men rule the world in Elizabethan England, and so we're seeing her as the product of their power. So she has no voice, she's quite quiet. We could also see her as the traditional approach of how a parent should be in Elizabethan England. We're not saying it's the right way for a mother to be, but we could say that does she model the way that parents are viewed to be in households where there is money? She could also be seen as a symbol of how parents don't understand their children. Even from the beginning of the play, we see how she struggles to talk to her own daughter. We can see her as a cold character, emotionless, and as we've talked about it, she could be emotionless on the outside, but actually on the inside she is quite emotional. It's up to us to decide that. We could also see her as silent, passive, and powerless. So is this character a character that has been controlled by society to the point where she doesn't feel the need to or can't speak? But also she's a character that's obsessed by appearance, which is very similar to Capulet themselves. Notice how the marriage to Paris appears because of how others might look, and they tone it down a bit because they're worried that how people might frown on them because they're having merriment after somebody's died in the family. But she also reflects attitudes towards romance and chivalry, and how she views Paris. But also she could be a sign that class affects motherhood. And if we compare her to the nurse, we see that actually two different types of motherhood, and the different position in class affects how much of a mother you actually are. Now, when we talk about the play, we need to be looking at language choices, but also we need to be thinking about choices in the story. And we can use those as our AO2 things. So we can say about these things and develop them further. So, for example, we can talk about how the nurse speaks more than her, which shows how comfortable the nurse is around Juliet, whereas the lack of dialogue from Lady Capulet shows how uncomfortable, how uneasy she is. And the question you've got to ask is, why is she so uneasy? Could it be that she's spent very little time with Juliet, so doesn't know her? And if we look at the course of the play, who spends the most time with Juliet between the two? It's the nurse. So we see that in the choices that Shakespeare's given us of how comfortable the nurse is. She spends more time. And in the story, there's only a few times where Juliet is with Lady Capulet. Another interesting choice is the fact that she doesn't speak publicly. Now, we don't see her talking to other characters outside the family, really. She actually doesn't appear in the party. Now, in some versions, film and in plays, they put her on stage, but she doesn't speak at the party. So, in a public situation, she doesn't talk. Now, clearly that could be the sense of how Elizabethan society expects women to behave a particular way. The fact that she doesn't speak at the party is because it's not her place in Elizabethan society to talk. And as mentioned before, she's never seen away from Capulet and Juliet. So is this an idea that maybe as a woman in Elizabethan society, you are only seen in relation to your husband and your child? You're not seen as anything other than a mother and wife. Whereas other characters in the story move out of their usual place that they live. But she doesn't. She remains in the house for the whole play. And another interesting choice is the fact that she is the second person to find Juliet dead. Now, we could read something in that, in terms of the way that Shakespeare structures that scene in Act 4. The order we could suggest in the way that they find Juliet reflects their relationship. The first person is the nurse. The second person is Juliet's mother. And the third person is the father. Now, we could infer from that that Shakespeare's trying to show us that the mother does care. And that's why she's the second person. She's the second closest person. The father, we've already seen in the story already, that his relationship with Juliet is complex and can change, and he can be quite unpleasant towards her. Yet the way that Shakespeare shows us in that scene is that maybe there is a particular order to show how much they care. And another choice is the fact that, like other characters in this play, they disappear. Why does she disappear after Act 4? Now, I tend to think that both the nurse and Lady Capulet both disappear from the story because they can't possibly cope. But another way we can view it is that maybe their roles are just confined to the house, and so they wouldn't go to the tomb in Act 5 to resolve things. And it's interesting that Lady Capulet appears at the beginning of the story but then disappears because of the news of what happened to Romeo. So we're kind of seeing a bit of a pattern in that mothers or mother figures, when their child dies or something bad happens, that they can't cope. So are we seeing, with the fact that Lady Capulet disappears after Act 4, the fact that she couldn't cope? And this actually is a sign of how caring and emotional she is. It's a shame that we only see that at the end of the story. Now, another thing to think about, and we'll keep doing this, is think about what is the audience supposed to feel towards the character. Now, it's interesting that the nurse and Lady Capulet feature quite often together, and we could probably say that, most audience people would like the nurse and they see her as a positive thing. And by Shakespeare having Lady Capulet with her. I think it's a little bit unfair, but we tend to warm towards the nurse, but we don't necessarily warm towards Lady Capulet. And I think it's really, really hard, because by placing Lady Capulet next to the nurse, it's really, really hard to kind of empathise with her, because we've got this lovely, warm, caring character, and we've got this character that is quite distant. So it's really hard for the audience to really like her. So then what do we feel as the audience? What's our attitude towards Lady Capulet? Is it pity? Do we feel sorry for her? So that the fact that she doesn't know how to love, maybe that's what Shakespeare's trying to do. It's easy to say that we're there to dislike her, but actually, if we think about the story, Lady Capulet doesn't do that much many horrible things. She does support her husband, which is what women had to do in those days. So maybe Shakespeare is trying to make us feel pity, and actually feel really, really sorry for her. We like the nurse, but we pity Lady Capulet, because with the nurse is everything Lady Capulet should be, but maybe she doesn't know how to behave. She's awkward. And remember, as we said at the opening of the play, she is very, very awkward in around Juliet. And so maybe that's what Shakespeare's trying to make us feel, this pity towards this character. And by placing her next to the nurse in scenes, that makes it clear to us. So another thing to think about with choices is to think about, what is Shakespeare doing with this character? What is he trying to do with her? So the role of the character, why does Shakespeare use it? Well, she is really the nurse, the role of the voice of parents. And she shows us how parents struggle. And she is there to show us, because at the end of the day, Lady Capulet and Capulet himself are trying to do what's best for the family and for themselves, and in their strange way for their child, because having a child married is a good thing in the Elizabethan world. To have a child unmarried and unable to be married is a really, really bad thing. It's a social stigma. It's something bad to frown on. So she's there as the voice of the parents to highlight the struggle that parents have. But also, she's there as a contrast to the close characters. So the friar and the nurse. She's there as a contrast and to kind of show us how the difficult line that parents have, because they've got to make some difficult choices, and yet you can see that the friar and the nurse don't have to make those difficult choices, and so they can be really kind and they can think about their feelings. But actually what the parents want is they want their child to survive, and sometimes that means being separate from the feelings. Now, we've already talked about how Shakespeare uses Lady Capulet to be a juxtaposition against the nurse, and we said how that helps to create that sense of pity that we feel there. But also would say how also Lady Capulet is a symbol of how women had no voice in society. And I think it's interesting if we look at the play and we look at the relationship between Juliet and her mother. Juliet, interestingly, is a woman with a voice, and we see her articulating that voice and speaking out and arguing with things. And she's very much somebody that's challenging the Elizabethan way of the world. In fact, in the way, she has to pretend to her father and to agree to what her father wants and to actually hide her voice, even though she's going behind his back. So we can see that Shakespeare uses this character in a number of different ways. Now, taking this further, we need to think about, well, what is Shakespeare trying to teach us? And we need to think about the context and the message that we're trying to get here. So here's a rough paragraph that we could start with. So Shakespeare presents Lady Capulet as a cold and distant parent. How does Shakespeare do that? Shakespeare uses a formal and emotionless register. Register just means a style of speech to reflect her relationship with Juliet. So what is Shakespeare doing by making the character cold and distant? Well, this is what he could be saying. He could be showing us how society was not child-focused. If we think about our own culture at the moment, society is very much about the child and about what the child feels, and so much so that it's all around what the child feels. The Elizabethan world is showing us how actually the world in Elizabethan times wasn't as emotional and focused on the child. And it's interesting that at the end of the play, what happens is we move from the opposite. So at the beginning, Lady Capulet is emotionless and cold, and by the end of the play, what have we done? We're talking about having a statue made of gold about Juliet and putting the focus on the child right at the end. But also this cold and distant parent shows us how your position in society is more important than your feelings. If we look at the nurse, how she's in a lower position than Lady Capulet, and she's got more feelings. So clearly, the higher you get, the less emotions you have with your child. But linked to that is how society expects you to behave in a particular way. Now this is where we could feel sympathy for Lady Capulet. Is she behaving the way that she behaves, not because she wants to, but because society expects her? So that people of a certain class have to be distant from their children. And hence why we have wet nurses in Elizabethan times, so that they didn't have to spend that time. And up until Victorian times, where we had governesses, that children were often farmed off to somebody else, and that the parent didn't take the full responsibility of raising the child. And added to that is this idea of how emotions could be bought. If we think about the nurse is somebody still around, ideally it would have been a wet nurse, but is still looking after the child. And even though she's, a teenager, she's being paid to be emotional with Juliet to replace the emotions of the parent. And linking into that, is this the problem that we have with class and money? Does money depersonalize things? So does the fact that the Capulets have a bit of money, they're not very, very rich, but they've got money, does the fact that they've got money and they've got status, does that mean that they depersonalize their children and treat Juliet as just an object? Now, all the time we want you to be thinking of your ideas and thinking where you can push things and how you can take things further. So here are just some questions to think, to get you thinking about the character and ideas behind the character. So here's an important thing to think about. Is Shakespeare trying to make us empathise or sympathise with Lady Capulet? I've mentioned pity, but what is Shakespeare trying to do with Lady Capulet? Is he trying to make us feel any emotions towards her? Are we supposed to feel kind of like her in that she's unable to articulate things? Is that a common experience for all of us? Why does Shakespeare have parents so different to their child? That's interesting. Can we see any characteristics in Juliet that we see in her parents? I would argue that we don't. And actually, the parents are so different to the child. And why does Shakespeare have the parents so different to their child? The other thing is Shakespeare subverting our attitude towards women? Naturally, we expect mothers to naturally care. So is Shakespeare questioning that? and trying to change attitudes towards women and show that women can be quite cold. And it's not naturally a thing to care. Another thing to think about is having a look at other Shakespeare plays. Does Shakespeare have a problem with mothers? Interestingly, most of his plays feature a father-daughter relationship, and usually mothers have died, or something happens to him, or the mother isn't pleasant enough. And so we see that in the story. If we look, tends to be about Capulet doing a lot of the things, and Lady Capulet's just in the background. She seems to be a bit of a servant for Capulet. So does Shakespeare have a problem with mothers in particular? Now, he's male, so that could be he identifies more with fathers than he does with mothers. But it does seem quite interesting when we think of other plays that he's written. Is Shakespeare suggesting society's rules are the problem, or is it just people? And then finally, why does Shakespeare make Lady Capulet and Lady Montague such small parts? Is there a reason behind it? Please do check our YouTube channel to find out for other revision videos on there. Thank you.